So, thank you for coming here. I am ATTILA. I tried to put together this program of this conference, and basically this panel has been proposed with the title Marx's Perspective from Romania and Yugoslavia. And actually Paul has spoken about the Yugoslavian perspectives, and Zsolt indicated the slight change which we have today. So the new title is Marx's Perspective from Romania, and I would like to introduce our colleagues. First of all, Attila SZIGETI. He's a researcher at Hungarian Institute of Philosophy at Budapest University. He will speak about Behind the Value for. And Alexander Csiszlakán, who is a lecturer at Bergstermann University and an editor at Critic-Attack. And it's my pleasure to chair this panel. And before we hear the lectures, I would like to speak about just a few words this project which we have at the institution and the aims of this project. First of all, I would like to start with a confession, and I would like to say that that being Marxist or a post-Marxist, it's very hard thing in Eastern Europe. It's very hard because and it's not a new phenomenon in Eastern European perspective. It has been always hard for nearly 100 years. Thinking critically, believe that the world and the social injustices can be changed and neoliberal capitalism can be destroyed, it's always been a hard thing. And the situation, I have to say, is getting worse because by the new rise of post-fascism, which have been elaborated by Michael in the previous panel. In my opinion, there is a double challenge and double situation facing us. And this is about hegemony from a Gramscian sense. On the one hand, after the Eastern European regime change, and in some sense, before the Eastern European regime change, the main challenge was the neoliberalism and the critical and uncompromisingly adaptation of neoliberal standards. And after the regime change, by 2000 and today, there is a cooperation, at least in my opinion, between the neoliberalism and the authoritarian state ruled by the right-wing national forces, especially in Hungary and Poland. And this conference and our project in this institution is about how can we understand this cooperation, how can we understand this situation, and I am convinced we need to find a way to be critical and to fight against this cooperation between neoliberalism and authoritarian state. That's why we need to recreate, re-enhance and restructure our politics and philosophy and ideology on the left or Eastern European perspective based on Marxism and post-Marxism. These are our assumptions, these are our aims, and I would like to ask Attila SZIGETI to have his lecture. Please, Attila.
I hope this works. Okay, can you hear me? I hope this works like this because I don't like to. So, it works, I guess? Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I'm grateful. And I have to warn you in advance that I prepared a theoretical paper because this is probably a joke, but because I'm a Hungarian from Romania, I thought that Alex here knows much better than me the Romanian Marxist theory and practice. So he will take the Romanian part. And my Hungarian colleagues from Budapest know much better than me the Hungarian practice or than me, so I can just theorize. Okay. Elaborate on other people's theories, basically. Jó, meg is foghatod. Itt megoldás, csak nem fura hallás. Okay, now it's better, I suppose. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, the aim of my talk is to present an expanded conception of capitalism as a system in which production through exploitation, the dimension originally revealed by Marx, and expropriation of reproduction are codependent. So this is the thesis. I will essentially reuse some Marxist, feminist, and ecological Marxist insights in order to argue that the expropriation, in the sense of an ongoing, continuous, original accumulation, so that expropriation of the cheap or unpaid work of the sphere of reproduction, taken in its broadest sense, so expropriation of the sphere of reproduction is a necessary enabling condition of capitalist production. So let's see first what does the term expropriation or its definition as an ongoing original accumulation means here. As we know, Marx develops his analysis of original accumulation in the 24th chapter of Capital's first book by asking, how did the capital relation, respectively the separation between propertyless producers, wage laborers, and the private property of the means of production, capital, come to exist? His answer is that capitalism was essentially created through the violent extra-economical process of dispossessing the peasantry of the land which he previously possessed, the well-known enclosure or imposing the commons, the commodification and privatization of the land, and by forcing the dispossessed peasantry into wage labor. While original accumulation was, in the conception of Marx, a pre-capitalist historical moment, several authors have argued after him, for the first time, as I know, Rosa Luxemburg and later Hannah Arendt, Maria Mies, David Harvey and others, that original accumulation should be seen as an ongoing, that is, not only genetic and transitional, but a constant structural feature of capitalism. Capitalism as a social totality of generalized exchange of commodities and of two classes antagonism does not and cannot exist because, as Luxemburg convincingly demonstrated in the accumulation of capital, accumulation always depends on the simultaneous existence of non-capitalist social strata and societies, and it is functionally related in all of its value relations, I quote Luxemburg, and material relations, with regard to constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value, to non-capitalist forms of production. So capital accumulation is in a dialectical contradiction, quote again Luxemburg, or in a process of metabolism with its milieu of non-capitalist social formations, or to use David Harvey's later description, in an inside-outside dialectical relation. It necessarily and continually requires some pre-existing outside, capitalism, or it creates its own outside. Now the inside-outside schema, that of a capitalist inside and a non-capitalist outside, is somehow misleading here, since the theoretical breakthrough of the idea of ongoing original accumulation is that capitalist exploitation of commodified labor power cannot work except through the expropriation of zones which are indeed outside the commodity system and the circulation of capital, but nevertheless functions as their necessary background conditions. This constitutive dependence relation suggests that we should rethink capitalism as being something larger than an economic system. Capitalism necessarily implies, as its constitutive parts, non- or extra-economical spheres. In fact, it can work only by expropriating them. So what we get here then is, as Nancy Fraser also proposed, an expanded, let's say three-layered conception of capitalism, behind first the fetishistic dimension of market exchange, and it's hidden about, this is a term used by Marx, of capitalist production, exploitation of surplus labor. We should look at the even more hidden moment of expropriation, the non-economic background conditions of capitalist accumulation, essentially social reproduction and nature. I will analyze those here, but we could also add other expropriated non-economical spheres like democratic politics, the cultural, creative and digital commons, the contemporary reserve army of the un- and underemployed, precarious or vulnerable employment, etc., etc. So let's turn now to the first non- or extra-economic background sphere, the sphere of social reproduction, from which Paul Stubbs also speaks in the Yugoslavian context. Starting with the 1970s, Marxist feminist scholar and activists claim that, contrary to the orthodox Marxist view, social reproduction or domestic labor cannot be separated from the relations between capital and waged labor. In fact, wage labor can be productive, it can produce surplus value only as long as it can expropriate the unwaged social reproduction. The exploitation of wage labor, of surplus time and labor, is made possible by, to use Maria Nice's terms, the super exploitation of non-wage labor. That is the time and labor necessary for people's own survival and subsistence, production. So in capitalism, the production of surplus value cannot be reduced to any particular process in a separated location, to wage work in a factory. It's a production which extends the whole society to the so-called social factory. The gender division of labor, in which gender becomes the career of specific work functions, the division between social reproduction, women's devaluated and invisible, unwaged work carried out in the private domestic sphere, household, and economic production, men's wage work, is a historical, specifically capitalist construction. As Silvia Federici famously argued, the historical moment of original accumulation also included first a new sexual division of labor, subjugating women's labor and reproductive function to the reproduction of the workforce, and second, the construction of a capitalist patriarchal order based upon the exclusion of women from wage work and their subordination to men. So to sum up this part, it was the gender division between production and reproduction which created a new capitalist form of male domination, and at the same time it also enabled the capitalist exploitation of labor power. Capitalist economic production, exploitation of wage work and accumulation of surplus value was built, and it is continually dependent on the expropriation of the extra-economic sphere of social reproduction. Another important extra-economic background condition of capitalist expropriation and accumulation is the expropriation of nature or earth ecology, which is a truly imperious issue, as we all know. Think of climate change and debate on Anthropocene, on Capitalocene, and so on. Questions that I will not treat here, nor I will enter in the debates and rifts of the field of contemporary ecological Marxism. Instead, in order to conceptualize the expropriation of nature, I will use the verticological theory of the Marxist critical geographer Jason Moore. Manifestly inspired by Marxist feminism, as well by word system theory and ecological Marxism, Moore's world ecology builds on a creative reconceptualization of the sphere of social reproduction as a more wide, social-ecological sphere of human and extra-human nature, is the term of Moore's. He rewrites the law of value as the law of cheap nature. Cheap nature being the necessary condition of accumulation of surplus value or capital, that is of abstract social labor, says Moore, is the appropriation of appropriation is the term for expropriation. Okay, Moore's term for expropriation it is the same term. So it's the appropriation of the unpaid work or energy of the four cheaps. First, the cheap labor power of women and slaves, essentially, the cheap food, as well as cheap, we come to the nature, what classically we think is nature, cheap energy and raw materials. Or to use the catchphrase of Maria Mies, frequently cited by Moore, the cheap or unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. So capitalist valorization works through the contradictory unity between, on the one hand, the narrow economical sphere of the value form, that is exploitation of labor power with commodity production. This is described by orthodox Marxist political economy. And on the other hand, a much more expansive extra-economic sphere of value relations, of the appropriation of the unpaid work for energy of cheap, uncapitalized natures, which lie outside the commodity system and the circuit of capital, but within reach of capitalist power and science. How much time? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay. So this contradictory relation between the exploitation of valued paid work and the appropriation of devalued unpaid work is asymmetrical. In several aspects, I will just mention two. First, there is a quantitative asymmetry in Moore's description. Every act of exploitation of commodified labor power depends on an even greater act of appropriation of human and extra-human nature's unpaid work or energy. Or as Moore aptly assumed, value doesn't work unless most work isn't valued. This could be slogan of Moore's word ecology. Value doesn't work unless most work isn't valued. Rising labor productivity in commodity production, like for example in the case of British and American-led industrial revolutions, have been conditioned on disproportionately greater appropriations of the value of unpaid work or energy performed by, on the one hand, human natures like domestic labor and the accumulated work of humans raised to adulthood outside the commodity system, think of dispossessed peasants, as well as by, on the other hand, extra-human natures, the accumulated energy of fossil fuel formation, coal, and then oil. Okay, I will skip here part, and to sum up these two perspectives, in this expanded conception of capitalism, the economic sphere of the value form, that is exploitation of waged work within the commodity system in order to accumulate surplus value. So the economic sphere depends essentially on what happens behind the value form. The expropriation of the unpaid work energy provided by different extra-economical spheres of non-commodification, like the social, reproductive, and the ecological spheres. So production through exploitation and expropriation of reproduction are intertwined aspects of the capitalist system: expropriation and subsequently gender oppression, ecological crisis, on and underemployment, the explosion of surplus populations and so on, is a structural feature of capitalism and a necessary background condition of exploitation. The economic sphere of the value form, so that's what I told you would be complicated. So the economic sphere of the value form, value production by wage work, must include as excluded, I know this sounds paradoxical, okay? So must include as excluded the devalued or non-valued non-work performed behind the value form in the sphere of reproduction in its broadest sense. The hidden foundation of capitalist value production is the cheap or devalued work of, to quote again Maria Mies, women, nature and colonies. Let me conclude briefly by highlighting two challenges posed by this conceptualization of capitalism. The first theoretical challenge will be that of the interaction or even the possible synthesis between different readings of Marx's critique of capitalism. In an inevitably sketchy way, one could differentiate here between three paradigmatic readings of this critique, or three dimensions of capitalism itself. Besides the capital accumulation through exploitation level, this would be the critical economical reading of capitalism, and the expropriation of reproduction perspective on which I elaborated here. There is another paradigmatic reading of Marx, best exemplified by the so-called critic of value, or value critic of value school of thought, presented by Moshe Postone and the Werk critic. They conceptualize capitalism as a system of self-domination created by the alienated social relations of abstract labor and ruled by the abstract but nevertheless very real logic of the self-valorizing automatic subject of value. The main drawback of this theory is that it posits exploitation and class domination, the level of the critics of critique of political economy, as a contingent epiphenomenal surface of this deep-seated abstract logic of value and capital. Now, the expropriation perspective, or at least its word ecological version developed by Moore, poses a different, but I think related problem. Here is abstract labor itself, the social production of value, which appears to be somehow epiphenomenal. Value being largely determined by the much expensive appropriation of the work or energy of nature. Or to put it in another way, the labor theory of value and its class antagonistic context is subordinated in Moore's theory to a more encompassing theory of value. Like, I don't know, the theory of energetical value, if you like. The challenge here is how to connect, if it is even possible, these three paradigmatic readings of Marx, or conceptualizations of capitalism, without reducing, on the one hand, the social production of value, and on the other hand, the exploitation, class antagonism dimension to an epiphenomenal status. Which leads me to the perhaps even more important normative political challenge, which is how to connect, on the one hand, class politics, that is, social struggles addressing the dimension of exploitation and proposing the collective control of commodity production and the equal distribution of value, with bio or eco-politics. So class politics with biopolitics and eco-politics, by which I mean social struggles led by the normative ideals of gender and ecological normative ideals. So how to link and address not just in theory, but also in radical political practice, the ecological crisis with the crisis of productive and reproductive work.